Hello, Christopher here with a different kind of video in defense of 10-man. This video will be about the still ongoing debate between 10 and 25-man raiding and why it, at this point, is old and perhaps even on the verge of being silly. I myself started raiding in vanilla on my mage. I've raided in every expansion and seen all the content in 40-man, 25-man, 20-man and 10-man format. In TBC and Wrathful Lich King, I raided in a 3 days a week 25-man guild ranked first on Moonglade, but it disbanded before Cataclysm launched, and luckily I eventually found a new home in the form of Apex, a 10-man raiding guild of Darkmoon Faire. Most, if not all, the information in this video has been compiled by our paladin main tank Miraven. I want to thank him for allowing me to use it. Don't forget to stick by it to the end. After the conclusion there will be a bonus clip. Do note that all of this information was posted before the nerf to Dragon Soul. The exact date, January 23rd of 2012. A number of concerns raised recently on my own realm, as well as the official World of Warcraft forums, have forced me to establish a more in-depth understanding of the differences between 25-man and 10-man raiding. Two seemingly identical challenges in slightly different formats, which turn out to be so much more than just that. We see a huge disparity in progress on a per boss basis, i.e. boss X is considered more difficult than one difficulty, whereas boss Y seems to favor a 25-man setup, which is understandable enough. All fights are made differently, well mostly, in order to challenge the team. Whether it consists of 10 or 25 people is irrelevant, and the player in different ways, which is where most of us find our joy in raiding, being challenged to the extremes in many different aspects, including reflexes, quick decision making, ability to keep a cool head, and to execute a pattern like DPS rotations as well as possible. First of all, let me start out by saying that this isn't a new debate. Ever since the changes introduced in Wrathful Lich King, where 10 and 25-man raids were available alongside each other on a reasonably similar footing, people from both sides have been arguing that their format has greater challenges or difficulty, be it pure number requirement, damage healing, more complicated mechanics, or whatever else people have been able to come up with. In my experience, this is often more true for 25-man raiders who feel their format is more true to the original format, since 40-man raids were scrapped in the Burning Crusade. Whether this is true, or whether 25-man raiders are simply louder, I don't know. This debate has become even more relevant in Cataclysm, where 10-man and 25-man raiding, at least officially, are considered equally demanding, and thus award the same rewards, for example Realm First, Feats of Strength, and loot. That is, of course, if you decide to see difficulty as the primary reason for raiding one or the other. I think it's relevant to have a look at the percentage of 25-man and 10-man guilds who have managed to kill various heroic encounters in Dragon Soul. I bring you the following numbers. The initial quick conclusions I can make from this table are the following. There are far more 10-man guilds than 25-man guilds out there progressing on tier 13 heroic modes. 25-man guilds seem to have a far greater success rate on every heroic encounter, except for Yorsha, the Unsleeping, and Ultraxion. This disparity increases considerably in later encounters. To emphasize my points, here's a chart displaying the difference in success rates for different heroic mode encounters for both 10 and 25-man. 100% indicates the total volume of guilds who have managed to complete the normal version of Manners of Deathwing. A lazy individual will call it quits here and simply say that 25-mans have more success, and thus must be easier, although I severely doubt that's necessarily true. Let's take a slightly more in-depth analysis to the different bosses, and determine especially why 10-mans seem to have more success on two particular bosses, and why the difference shines through in later encounters in particular. I would like to point out that I am not a statistician or mathematician, so when it comes to in-depth number crunching, I am by no means flawless. Please do correct any discrepancies in the comments if you stumble over something you disagree with. In World of Warcraft, different classes bring different raid buffs or debuffs to the table. The more players you have, the more likely you are to have all fronts covered. Simple as that. This is less relevant since the release of Cataclysm, where we had a huge homogenization of buffs, i.e. multiple classes are able to provide the same buffs more often, and certain classes, paladins, shamans, warlocks and hunters to a degree, can choose which to provide, in some ways being able to compensate for a missing raid member of a certain class. That said, it can still be a problem for a 10-man team to successfully collect the raid members required to fully buff the raid. Here's an example of a technically viable 10-man raid composition, which is missing very basic buffs, such as 3% damage done, replenishment, and a raid-wide haste increase. This particular composition would have a very hard time with many of the bosses in Dragon Soul, simply due to these shortcomings. The fights are unforgiving, and a buff here and there can and has made the difference between a kill and a wipe in the past. 25-mans, on the other hand, would seriously need to attempt to not get every buff they could possibly get their hands on. Usually, I would consider buffs a core game mechanic. Each class brings something unique, or as it is now, not so unique, to the team to help out. In this particular context, when analyzing which of the two raiding formats are harder, I want to draw a parallel to handicaps in many other sports and activities. You're granted a buff because you feel you need it to compete on the same level as others. Okay, the comparison is perhaps a little extreme, and I go so far as to say unfair, but I hope my point gets across. 25-mans will inevitably have a better backing in the form of buffs the majority of times, but I think it would be naive to attribute everything we see in the above numbers and charts to buffs exclusively. Now, for flexibility in rosters. On 10-man, it's customary to use 2 tanks, 3 or 2 healers, and have the rest of your team fill up with damage dealers. For some fights, having 4 healers can be an advantage, like Morchok 10 Heroic, 2 tanks and 4 damage dealers. This means 40% of your team is healing, 20% is tanking, and 4% is dealing damage. It's certainly doable in other formats, but especially at the beginning of Dragon Soul, this is what all 10-man guilds decided to roll with, my own guild included. On 25-man is a whole other story. I haven't personally done the fight on 25-man, but the usual recommended setups I can come across include 6 healers, which is 25% of your raid team, 2 tanks, 8% of your raid team, and 17 damage dealers, 67%. Alternately, you can tack on another 2 healers, making your healing composition take up 32% of the entire raid, allowing for a higher ratio of dedicated damage dealers to utility players, tanks and healers, compared to 10-man. This brings me to the next section I believe is worth mentioning. One of the primary complaints received by 25-man guilds is the overtuning of boss health pools compared to what they have in the corresponding 10-man encounter. 2 examples stick out from the past and the current tier. In Firelands, the culprit was Balrog, on whom 25-man guilds experienced having genuine problems with the enraged timer. I don't have any statistics to back up the data, especially since the nerf ban hit Firelands, but I do for this tier. Utraxion of this tier is one of only 2 fights where 10-man guilds are ahead of 25-man guilds. So, I figure it would be interesting to look at this fight in particular, seeing as it sticks out pretty heavily from the general consensus. Let's take one of the standard bosses that have the closest ratio of downs between 10 and 25-man, returning to Morchok. On 10-man Heroic, the boss has 42,946,000 health, and on 25-man, the boss has 180,404,192 health. If we break it down on a DPS health ratio, this means that on 10-man, each DPS has to, on average, deal 10,736,500 damage. With a 7-minute enrage timer, this boils down to a requirement of 25,536 DPS. Note that this assumes your tanks and healers are dealing no damage, which is obviously not the case, but for the sake of analyzing the strain on damage dealers, which is one of the primary complaints. The corresponding number for 25 man with 6 healers, 2 tanks and 2 damage dealers is 22,108 damage per second per damage dealer, which can only be considered a low requirement. I'm not willing to conclude that the 25 man version of this encounter is necessarily easier, but I'll allow you to draw your own conclusions on this point. The biggest difference in terms of difficulty, I believe, comes from basic fight mechanics being tuned differently. For example, if a mechanic on 10 man requires X number of plays to do Y, then on 25 man, to statistically fit the requirements, then Y should be performed X times 2.5. This isn't always the case, and in Dragon Soul we see examples of lenient mechanics on both 10 and 25 man. For my first example, I have Hagar the Stormbinder. Marked on the figure in front of you are the locations of the beacons that require energizing in Hagar's lightning phase. I've chosen this one because, as evidenced by the previous chart, a lot of 10 man guilds have a lot of problems with this particular encounter compared to 25 man. On 25 man, 4 beacons have to be energized, 10 man have 8. On 25 man, however, you have the luxury of being far more lenient with spacing, whereas on 10 man, you are trying to space your raid team out perfectly between the beacons before a stacking debuff drops you. Here's a fight I would consider severely imbalanced in 25 man's favor when looking at the two different difficulties. Most of the damage going out is similar on the two difficulties, adding another 25 man favoring element to the fight. There's no more damage, except of course the addition of raid members taking the same amount of damage compared to 10 man, and the healer / damage composition isn't skewed to the point where this works against 25 man's favor. Another example is your Showdown Sleeping. As previously mentioned, it is one of the fights where 10 mans pull ahead of 25 mans. Since I've been unable to find a lot of information about specific damage values from sources such as Wikipedia, most of my thoughts about this particular encounter will remain anecdotal. The fight has a reasonably tight enrage timer, which forces 10-man teams to, very often, use a single tank. We managed to squeeze in 2, even if that's largely unheard of. This requires excellent cooldown management from the tank and healers, of which there are only 2. The fight felt well tuned as an introductory heroic boss for that particular format. On both difficulties, bosses drop 1 piece of gear per 5 people. That's 5 drops on 25 man, 2 on 10 man. The exception to this is tier tokens, where 25 mans receive 2 tokens per boss, 1 token per 12.5 people, and 10 mans receive 1 token per 10 people. In this equation, 25 mans have it slightly easier when it comes to getting tier pieces. With normal pieces of loot, the story is the same. Sure, there are chances of duplicate loot, but with more than twice as many people to share the loot, there's a vastly greater chance that another person can take the duplicate piece. With regards to armor types, most of the time you'll find every single class in a 25-man raid, or at the very least much more often than in a 10-man. I run raids where we, as a 10-man team, had no takers for a Vanquisher token, i.e. no mages, druids, death knights and rogues, something very unlikely to ever happen in a 25-man guild. In short, 25-mans will disenchantalize loot, at least earlier on in progress. This could be one of the potential reasons why 25-mans are currently ahead. There's a good chance one could say a lot more about balancing of fights in Dragon Soul, but most of the time I don't hear any facts over loud, obnoxious opinions. I believe everyone has their preferred raiding format, be it 10 or 25 man. I think it's easy to conclude a thing or two from the data I've managed to gather on the subject, however. First of all, 25 mans often give off the impression of being overtuned, even when they're not. Yes, 25-man bosses have, in a direct comparison, more health per raid member. This comes down to multiple factors, such as greater flexibility in its setup, allowing most compositions to bring all raid buffs to raid, resulting in better raid performance, 10-mans are far more rigid. Fewer numbers of players having to engage in puzzles required to beat the fight. Only 2 tanks are required, exactly like 10-man fights. Much lower tank DPS ratio, allowing the raid to put out more DPS. Some fights genuinely are over or under-tuned on either difficulty. This can easily be seen on the number of kills, which carry good statistical significance. 25-man guilds are, on average, much more progressed than 10-man guilds. Different people prefer different formats. Rate what you enjoy the most and don't smear the opposite side for preferring the opposite format. Gear is easier and faster to acquire in 25-man than it is in 10-man. Final conclusion. Neither type is necessarily more difficult to play in. In fact, I'd say the 10-man raiding is more about bringing the correct raid as a whole, and for the raid to work together well. If one person dies on 10-man, that's 10% of your team dead. On 25-man, one death means 4% of your roster is missing, where 25-man guilds have to worry less about making sure they bring that one Balance Druid or Shadow Priest for increased spell haste, since the roster is most likely teeming with people who can provide that buff. On 10-man, this is a very real concern at times. Inversely, every player in 25-man guild knows they have all the buffs they could possibly get their hands on, and have to make sure their personal performance is top notch. 10-man can be more brutal, or it can be more lenient due to the buff situation. There are, of course, things I can't evaluate from looking at numbers, guides and character sheets. Do more hardcore players genuinely prefer 25-man raids? I don't know, but I don't think so. Are 25-man players better than 10-man players? I doubt it. Draw your own conclusions on these questions, but patronizing people running other formats than yourself is low, when it's impossible to back up your opinion with a well-analyzed fact. I encourage everyone to play the setup they enjoy the most. Well guys, that's it. I want to thank you all for watching, and I hope you've been enjoying the video. I want to once again thank Miraven, our main tank, for allowing me to use the information he posted about this matter, as I find it quite interesting myself. Now, before this video ends, I will give you one bonus clip that I hope you guys enjoy. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time.